Good day, everyone. We were going to tackle about the Philippine history from Spanish to Japanese era. First, we will talk about the Spanish era and what are the changes it brought to the Philippines. Spanish influence made an impact on the indigenous culture through the change in religion, Filipino names, intermarriage, foods, form of amusement, clothes, and education. When Magellan came in 1521, aside from Christianity, they also brought their intermarriage, different cuisine, clothes, and most especially education, which more focused on teaching Spanish language. So next is religion. Bathala, Anito, and Babaylan. As we all know, before the Spanish came, many Filipinos believe in other creatures such as Bathala, Anito, and Babaylan. First is Bathala, is the transcendent supreme being, the originator and ruler of the universe. Filipinos believe that Bathala is the creator of all kinds. So the next one is Anito. It refers to the ancestor spirit, nature spirit, and deities in the indigenous Philippine folk religion. So the last one is Babayland. It is an individual or a group of healers, mostly women, who were acknowledged by friends and a family as possessing extraordinary gifts. So Filipino believe that Babayland can call Bathala by sacrificing foods or animals. Sacrificing animals and foods can help them to talk to their god or Bathala. So as we can see in the picture, the first one is look like a god. So this is called Bathala. The second one is the Anito, which is look like a kid. And the number 3 is the Babaylan, which is, as I said earlier, it is group of women.
Changes in Filipino names. Before the Spanish invasion to the Philippines, the Filipinos had no surnames. The native Filipino parents were acquainted in naming their sons and daughters according to their physical characteristics, qualities, or to some coincidental events. The name of a boy, for example, was taken from his physical appearance or from any natural event. Thus, if a boy looked strong, he was named Malakas. If a girl looked beautiful, she was named Maganda. Another example is makaraeg, matapang, masipag, di magiba, ginto, magsaysay, makapagal, batong bakal, and etc. The Spaniards at first made little changes in the names of the Filipinos. Those who had Christian surnames chose Spanish names, usually the names of the saints. For example, Santo Tomas, San Gregorio, or San Andres, and so forth. Intermarriages. There were very few recorded marriages between Filipino male and a Spanish male, and Filipino male and Chinese woman. Spanish mestizo. It is an offspring of Spanish interbreeding with Filipinos. The term mestizo means mixed in Spanish and is generally used throughout Latin America to describe people of mixed ancestry with a white European and an indigenous background. Similarly, the term mulatto in Spanish, commonly refers to a mixed race ancestry that includes white European and black African roots. Next is mestizo de sangre. It is a person of Filipino or any racial descent marrying a Chinese. The result is children that will be called mestizo de sangre. Indio or India. They were the pure-blooded natives.
Spaniards has a great influence in the Philippines. Historians said that almost 80% of the Filipino cuisines have originated from Spain. You can tell that Filipino food being served on fiestas has Spanish influences. You might see relleno, paella, embutido, callos, morcon, and the likes being served during special occasions in the Philippines. Spaniards also introduced some cooking techniques to the Filipinos during their colonial period. Spanish way of sautéing are still observed nowadays. Baking cooking techniques are also taught to the Filipinos. Even our forms of amusement has Spanish influence. Cockfighting was widely recognized form of entertainment, other like horse racing and bullfighting. Most of these are evident during fiesta.
The Spanish era brought about Spanish ethics, which influenced Christianized women to wear a skirt called the saya and a blouse called the baro, which was worn throughout the 400 years of colonization. Western style of clothing was introduced for the men, while women upgraded their clothing to make it more Spanish. Changes in clothing became a status symbol and way of distinguish the natives from the Spaniards. The pre-Spanish system of education underwent major changes during the Spanish colonization. The tribal tutors were replaced by the Spanish missionaries. Primary instruction was free, and the teaching of Spanish was compulsory. Education during that period was inadequate, suppressed, and controlled. During the Spanish reign, they established Catholic run schools. Priors and nuns were the teachers at the schools. The Filipino people was literate before the Spanish ever arrived, but the Spanish added new subjects to their academia such as math, Spanish, and business. In time, the Spanish also set up colleges segregated by gender. One of the more well-known of these colleges is the University of Santo Tomas, which was established way back 1611.
The U.S. military government in the Philippines. The United States military government of the Philippine Island was a military government in the Philippines, established by United States on August 12, 1898, a day after the capture of Manila, with General Wesley Merritt acting as military government. After the appointment of a civil governor-general, the procedure developed that as parts of the country were pacified and placed firmly under American control, responsibility for the area would be passed to the civilian. President William McKinley appointed the Taft Commission on 16 March 1900 to supervise the adjustment of the Philippine Islands government from military command to civil rule, also known as the Philippine Second Commission.
The Commonwealth Government. The Commonwealth of the Philippines was the administrative body that governed the Philippines from 1935 to 1946. Aside from a period of exile in the Second World War from 1942 to 1945 when Japan occupied the country. The Philippine Bill of 1902, also known as the Cooper Act, sponsored by U.S. Representative Henry A. Cooper of Wisconsin. On July 1, 1902, the Philippine Bill of 1902 was passed Congress. It created the Philippine Assembly. Among the key provisions of the bill, a Bill of Rights of the Filipinos, the appointment of the two Filipino resident commissioners to represent the Philippines in the U.S. Congress but without voting rights, the establishment of a Philippine Assembly to be elected by the Filipinos 2 years after the publications of a census and only after peace has been completely restored in the country. Among the key provisions of the bill, executive power would be exercised by the civil governor who would have executive departments under him such as Interior, Public Information, Finance, Justice, Commerce, and Police. The Philippine Assembly. The Philippine Assembly was the lower house of the Philippine Legislative from 1907 to 1916. On July 30, 1907, the first free national elections were held in the Philippines for members of all Filipino lawmaking body. Hundreds of candidates campaigned under many new political parties. 80 delegates won. Most of them came from the Nacionalista Party. Nacionalista Party is the oldest political party in the Philippines and in Southeast Asia, responsible for leading the country throughout the majority of the 20th century since its founding in 1907. Hundreds of candidates campaigned under Philippine Assembly, inaugurated on October 16, 1907, at the Manila Grand Opera House. Sergio Osmeña, the Speaker, and Manuel L. Quezon was Majority Floor Leader. Manuel L. Quezon served from 1909 to 1916. Accomplishments: establishment of the banks for farmers, improvement in the country's communication system and infrastructure, provisions of irrigation, establishment of the National Library. Resident Commissioners. The Philippine Bill of 1902 gave the Filipinos the right to be represented by two Filipino resident commissioners in the United States Congress resident commissioners. They spoke out strongly against those they considered harmful to Filipinos' interests. There are Benito Legarda and Pablo Campo. The Philippine Nations of Government. The Americans made it a policy to appoint qualified Filipinos to government positions. In 1903, there were 2,777 Americans in the government, then Philippines or the Filipinos, which were 2,697. In 1904, the number rose to 3,377 compared to 3,228 Americans. The Philippine Nations of the government, Florentino Torres became Attorney General. The Jones Law, signed by President Woodrow Wilson on August 29, 1916, sponsored by U.S. Representative William Atkinson Jones of Virginia, enacted by the 64th Congress of the United States on August 29, 1916, contained the first formal and official declarations of the United States commitment to grant independence to the Philippines. It defined the structure of the government, the power and duties of the official, and provided for a Bill of Rights for the Filipinos. The law provides that the grant of independence would come only as soon as a stable government can be established. The executive power is led by the governor. Legislative, exclusively for the Filipinos, was subdivided into two departments. The first is the upper house, the Senate, and the lower house for the House of Representatives. And judiciary also consists of two divisions. The Chief Justice were Filipinos, and the acting judge were Filipinos and Americans.
On October 3, 1916, elections were held for the new Philippine legislature. It was formally inaugurated on October 16, 1916. Sergio Osmeña was elected Speaker of the House of Representatives. Manuel L. Quezon became President of the Senate. The Ozarks Mission was a campaign for self-government and United States recognition of the independence of the Philippines, led by the former Senate President Sergio Osmeña and House Speaker Manuel Rojas. The mission, secured by the Hair Horse Cutting Act, which was rejected by the Philippine legislature and Manuel Quezon. The Hair Horse Cutting Act. It would establish the Philippine government as a transition government for 12 years before receiving independence in July 4, 1946. It separated the Philippine legislature into two camps. The pros were led by Osmeña and Rojas, while the antis is led by President Manuel L. Quezon. The Tidings-McDuffie Law. The Tidings-McDuffie Law is a new independence measure called the Tidings-McDuffie Law, so named after its sponsor, Senator Millard Tydings and Representative John McDuffie, was passed and signed by President Roosevelt on March 24, 1934. It was a revised copy of the spurned HHC Act of 1993. The only difference from the HHC Act were the change in the title, the elimination of military reservation, and the modification of certain vouch provisions. November 15, 1935, the 1935 American government allowed Filipinos to rule their own government. This is the time where they inaugurate of the Philippine Commonwealth.
So now I will discuss the development and progress under American rule. Number 1. Economic and social development. The first official census conducted by Spanish government in 1877 put the population of the Philippines at 7.5 million Filipinos. 5 years after the transfer of control from Spain, the census of 1903 undertaken by American administration counted 17.1 million Filipinos. Number 2. Infrastructure. Americans set up essential public infrastructures such as roads, bridges, ports, irrigations, and water systems for public health. They also improved public health through eradication of disease and improvement of public sanitation in waterworks, health centers, public hospitals, and clinics. Number 3. Education. In August 1901, 600 teachers called Thomasites arrived. Their name derived from ship they traveled on, the USS Thomas. Also, in 1901, the public schools were opened up. The medium of instruction is English. Schools established University of the Philippines, Philippine Normal College, and other agricultural schools. Number 4. Religion. In 1902, the Protestantism was introduced. More or less than 300,000 Filipinos become Protestants. Philippine Independent Church was established in Manila. The founder is Isabelo de los Reyes, and Gregorio Aglipay agreed to head the new church, and they also separate the church from the state. Number 5. Government. Democracy is the greatest legacy that the Americans gives us. The government has 3 branches: the executive that carries out the laws, legislative makes the laws, and judiciary evaluates the laws.
So now we are going to discuss the Japanese occupation in the Philippines. The Japanese occupation of the Philippines occurred between 1942 and 1945 when Imperial Japan occupied the Commonwealth of the Philippines during World War II. So, almost 300 years nga na sinakop ng Japan yung bansang Pilipinas. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. So, why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor? It is because Japan intended to attack as a preventive action to prevent the United States Pacific Fleet from interfering with its planned military action in Southeast Asia against overseas territories of the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and those of the United States. The invasion of the Philippines started on December 8, 1941, so 10 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. As at the Pearl Harbor, American aircraft were severely damaged in initial Japanese attack. Japan launched invasion on the Philippines began at the Manila. On December 8, Ibarra Air Base and Clark Air Base were bombed. So, pagtapos ng pasabugin ng mga Japan yung Pearl Harbor is ninext naman nila itong yung Ibarra Air Base and Clark Air Base na pasabugin o atakihin dahil nga dito nakalagay yung mga aircrafts or mga kagamitang pandigmaan sa himpapawid ng mga Amerika. Also, noong December, Sangli Naval Base and Cavite was destroyed. Japanese troops landed at the Lingayen Gulf on December 22, 1941 and advanced across central Luzon towards Manila.
So now to discuss all about the Japanese occupation in the Philippines. So on the advice of President Quezon General MacArthur declared Manila an open city on December 26, 1941. So noong December 26, 1941, sa gitna ng mga banta ng mga pag-atake ng mga Japanese, ang Maynila ay dineklara na open city ni Field Marshal Douglas MacArthur sa pagsisikap na iligtas ang lungsod at mga naninirahan dito mula sa mga pinsala. So ang lahat ng mga installation ng mga militar ay inutusan tanggalin habang ang mga lokal na mga pulis ay naiwan upang manatili ang kaayusan. And then the Japanese occupied Maynila on January 2, 1942. So ang Maynila ay dineklara ng isang bukas na lungsod upang maiwasan ang pagkawasak nito. Ang sinakop nga ng mga Japanese noong January 2, 1942. So nagpatuloy ang mga depensa ng mga Pilipinas hanggang sa huling pagsuko ng mga Persa ng US Philippines sa Bataang Peninsula noong April 1942 at sa mga Corregidor noong Mayo. And then, sa March 12, General Douglas MacArthur leaves the Philippines. So, yan, matapos makipagpunyagi laban sa mga malaking pagsubok na iligtas ang ang Pilipinas mula sa pananakop ng mga Japanese. So, iniwan nga ni General Douglas MacArthur ang US ang kuta ng mga isla ng Corregidor sa ilalim ng utos ni Pangulong Franklin Roosevelt. So, and then, sa April 3 to 8, there are no longer any reserve troops. So, yun nga, ito yung mayroong mas mahabang reserva ng mga tropa o yung mga sundalo. And then, so yun nga, matapos nga yun, ang April ng General Edward King Jr. surrendered the 75,000 troops of Bataan. So, noong April 9, 1942, nga, sumuko na si Major General Edward C. King Jr. sa Bataang, Pilipinas laban sa mga utos na ni General Douglas MacArthur at ang 78,000 mga troops. So, 66,000 ang Pilipino at ang 12,000 naman ang mga Amerikano. So, ang pinakamalaking grupo ng mga sundalong US na sumuko ang binihag ng mga Japanese. And last, during the infamous threat on the Bataan that March, the prisoners were forced to march 65 miles in 6 days in searing tropical heat with no provisions for foods, water, shelters, or medicine. So, and then, ang mga nahuling Amerikano at ang Pilipinong lalaki ay isinailalim sa Bataang Dead March. Isang pahirap na marsya na higit sa 65 milya kung saan libo-libong tropa ang mga namatay dahil sa mga gutom, mga dehydration at mga walang bayad na karahasan. Libo-libo pa ang mga namatay sa mga bilanggo ng mga kampo ng mga digmaan bago sila pinalaya sa pagkalipas ng 3 taon.
The Bataan Death March. After the April 9, 1942, U.S. surrender of the Bataan Peninsula on the main Philippine island of Luzon to the Japanese during World War II, 1939 to 1945, the approximately 75,000 Filipino and American troops on Bataan were forced to make an arduous 65-mile march to prison camps. The marchers made the trek in intense heat and were subjected to harsh treatment by Japanese guards. Thousands perished in what became known as the Bataan Death March. On May 6, 1942, U.S. Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright surrenders all U.S. troops in the Philippines to the Japanese. The island of Corregidor remained the last Allied stronghold in the Philippines after the Japanese victory at Bataan. constant artillery, shelling, and aerial bombardment attacks ate away at the American and Filipino defenders, although still managing to sink many Japanese barges as they approached to the northern shores of the island. The Allied troops could hold the invader off no longer. General Wainwright, only recently promoted to the rank of Lieutenant General and Commander of the U.S. Armed Forces in the Philippines, offered to surrender Corregidor to Japanese general. The Philippine Commonwealth Army was created by Philippine Commonwealth Act No. 1, approved December 21, 1935, with the threat of war with Japan imminent on July 26, 1941. A new command in the Far East was created, known as the United States Army Forces Far East. On the same date, President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, issued Presidential Order, which called the Philippine Commonwealth Army into the service of the Armed Forces of the United States. Presidential Order of July 26, 1941 did not order all the military forces of the Philippine government into the service of the United States Armed Forces. Only those units and personnel indicated in orders issued by a general officer of the United States Army were mobilized and made an integral part of the United States Army Forces Far East. Only those members of a unit who physically reported for duty were inducted. Filipino guerrilla. Not all Filipinos surrendered to Japan. In the early days of the occupation, many Filipino soldiers and officers had escaped from Bataan and other battlefields, and numerous patriotic civilians secretly organized themselves into guerrilla units in order to keep aglow the torch of democracy in their land. Japan occupied the Philippines for over 3 years until the surrender of Japan. A highly effective guerrilla campaign by Philippine resistance forces controlled 60% of the islands, mostly jungle and mountain areas. MacArthur supplied them by submarine and sent reinforcement and officers. Filipinos remained loyal to the United States, partly because of the American guarantee of independence and also because the Japanese had pressed large numbers of Filipinos into work details and even put young Filipino women into brothels. This is the Japanese main objectives. So first, to prevent use of Philippines as an advanced American military base. Second, to acquire staging areas and supply bases to enhance operations. And last, to secure communication lines from Japanese home island. The Second Philippine Republic, officially known as the Republic of the Philippines, and also known as the Japanese-sponsored Philippine Republic, was a Japanese puppet state established on October 14, 1943 during the Japanese occupation.
Jose P. Laurel was appointed to lead the Japanese imperial government as the third president in the Second Republic in the Philippines, also referred to as the puppet government, alongside with Benigno S. Aquino Sr. as vice president for 2 years, from 1943 to 1945, and the rest of the administration were also appointed by the Imperial Japan. And from 1944 to 1946 were the most dramatic part in the Philippines' history. It was the period when Filipinos showed their determination to take back their independence. The liberation period was one of the most thrilling episodes of the struggles of the Filipinos to restore and preserve their sovereignty. Because of the overwhelming surprise attack from Emperor Japan, on March 1942, General Douglas MacArthur was ordered to leave the Philippines. Arriving in Australia, he made a public promise to return and liberate the Philippines. By October 20, 1944, General MacArthur made his dramatic entrance on the shore of Red Beach in Palo Leyte, with 174,000 American troops ferried by an armada of 700 U.S. warships landed. With the support of U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, MacArthur fulfilled his promise to the Filipinos to liberate the Philippines from the Emperor Japan. On the return of the Americans, who led by General Douglas MacArthur, the biggest naval battle in U.S. history was about to happen. After the Great Landing in Leyte on October 23, 1944, began the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And finally, General Douglas MacArthur declared on July 4, 1945, the entire Philippines are now liberated, and the Philippines campaign can be regarded as virtually closed.